Ladies and gentlemen, in a moment we will start the lecture we've all been waiting for, delivered by the Nobel Prize winner and the creator of new economic geography and new foreign trade theory, Professor Emeritus at the Princeton University. Back at Ronald Reagan times, he served as an advisor to the president. He authored more than 200 books and papers and renowned titles, and he's also known as a New York Times columnist, and this is his first visit to Poland ever. So again, let's give him a big round of applause. Professor Paul Krugman will deliver a lecture on the future of Europe.
Mr. Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I'm leaving.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to receive this award, and especially, I mean, Copernicus, it's very much at the dawn of science, the dawn of critical thought, the dawn of finding the truth as best you can, regardless of dogma, all things to be enormously admired and remembered, because this is never a war that is finally won. It's something we always have to face. I was asked to speak about the future of Europe, which is actually it's a topic quite dear to my own heart. American economists, American politicians are often rather hostile, or at least indifferent to matters European. They are not as they look at the ways in which Europe does things wrong, which of course it does, everyone does. They look at the failures, you know, the places where it falls short. But I've always been an enormous admirer of Europe's achievements since World War II. And while there are some disappointments, and I'll talk about those, we shouldn't lose sight of those, nor should we be too pessimistic. If I can say, there's one thing, this is not just the ugly American speaking, you know, with critiques, but if there's one thing that Europeans tend to be really quite good at, it's at being critical of themselves and despairing about the future of this continent. And I'm going to argue that that's wrong, that there are some real issues that need to be addressed, but I do think we do need to talk about it. So what do we mean by Europe? I actually wasn't given instructions on how to define the subject, but what I mean is the project of European integration, the project of creating a zone of free movement of goods and people, above all, a zone of democratic values, to create, you know, basically at this point, although it's a big world out there, it's still very, very important that Europe be a leader in the values that we want humanity to serve. And the history of European integration is a long one. If you like, it begins in 1952 with the coal and steel community. It was about, initially, yes, efficiency gains from integration, but the purpose of that first set of European institutions was, among other things, to harness the power of commerce in the service of peace. It was designed not simply to make Europe's coal and steel industries more efficient, but also to make another war between France and Germany impossible, which so far it has succeeded in doing. In fact, there have been a few conflicts, and of course there's a huge one raging now at Europe's eastern border, but Europe has become, by historical standards, incredibly peaceful. There have been some of the hopes, many of the hopes that people had in the early stages of European integration have been fulfilled. Europe is prosperous, despite what you may hear, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It is democratic with some backsliding in some places, but still. And it is overall I would say, the most decent societies ever created in human history. Never in the course of human history have as many people had a decent life with freedom and at least some protection from the hazards of economic uncertainty as in Europe. And I am including the United States, which falls very far short on those dimensions. There are some, well, I'll get to the disappointments. I think at the beginning, many people had hoped, and still do hope, that at some point the integration becomes much deeper than it is, that at some point you really truly have a Europe that is a unified force in the world, which it is in some respects, but not to the extent we would have hoped. We would have liked, we still hope that Europe becomes a bastion of freedom, democracy, stability for the world. And it is taking some steps in that direction, but clearly has fallen short of where we wanted it to go. That said, there's a long history of what you might call Euro-pessimism, of beliefs. I've been in this business of economics for a long time. And over the course of my professional life, I would identify at least 4 times when people said, oh, Europe is really doomed. It's really failing. The first would have been in the 1980s with the problem of Eurosclerosis, large-scale, persistent unemployment in Europe. To an amazing extent, I find that in my own country, economists believe that never ended. And they're not really aware. If you actually look at, particularly at the nations of Northwest Europe, their employment performance is fine, in some ways better than that of the United States. But there was a period when people thought that somehow Europe, particularly that Europe's attempts at social justice somehow doomed it to mass unemployment, which turned out not to happen. There was a second phase, which is definitely relevant now, when in the early stages of the information technology revolution, Europe lagged behind the United States. There's the famous quote from Jacques Chirac of France, who said that the internet is an Anglo-Saxon network. There was indeed a period when the adoption of information technology lagged in Europe, but it didn't last. In the end, the technological level is quite similar. The internet in much of Europe is faster and cheaper than it is in the United States. So that was but there was an extraordinary amount of doomsaying in the late 1990s about Europe and technology. The third, which was very serious, was the Euro crisis of 2010 through roughly 2013, beginning with Greece, spreading to other parts of Southern Europe, immensely costly, immensely damaging, both economically and I would say politically. It turned out that the problems of debt, the enforced austerity, the situation in which policies were being dictated to democratic nations by officials in Brussels and Frankfurt was really, really bad for the sense of European unity. And I don't think that damage has been overcome. But Europe did, in fact, finally, and I'll show you in a second, did recover better than people realize from the Euro crisis. And now, here we are again, where there's a lot of talk about Europe losing competitiveness, falling behind. And it is, in fact, true that right now the cutting edge of technology is kind of elsewhere, that Europe is not really part of of the most exciting things happening. I would say that there's every reason to believe that that's a temporary issue, that this is not a fundamental failing. And what we learned from the last time that technology was an issue is that what matters is less whether you have the firms that are producing the latest technology as whether you are able to make use of it. And in the end, that's what turned out to be the case with the internet. I believe that, well, nobody knows what artificial intelligence is actually going to do, but whatever it is, I have no good reason to think that Europe will fall short. But at this point, with people talking down Europe because of the apparent technological lag, you have a lot of really strong negativity, both sides of the Atlantic. Mario Draghi is preparing a report on European competitiveness that is all about falling behind on advanced technology, which is true, but I think is exaggerated. There's a lot of bad statistics being cited. I keep on hearing people talking about how the euro area was the same size as the US economy and is now very much smaller. And what people who do that generally don't realize is that they're looking at nominal values converted at market exchange rates, and that what they're really talking about mostly is simply that the euro is weaker against the dollar. It's not actually as much of a growth lag as they imagine, and it's a much less striking point. Which brings me to my first actual slide here. How has economic growth compared? And I compare Europe with the United States because it's a benchmark. China, which is the other great economic superpower out there, is a whole other story. But let's compare Europe with the United States. I wasn't sure whether I should bring it up to date. The post-COVID period has been complicated, and the US has turned in a stronger recovery, but that's probably a temporary phenomenon. But let's talk about it a little bit longer. When do I start? I decided to start in 2004, which is the major part of the Eastern enlargement, this country, among others, joining the European Union. And what do we actually see in terms of economic growth? Somewhere here, there we go. What actually happened? And so comparing the European Union with the United States. This is a European Union redefined to exclude Britain, which is another whole issue. Yes, the US economy has grown more. Not as much, not 44% more, which is the number you sometimes hear, but the US economy has grown more than the European economy. But it's really important when you make these comparisons to take demography into account. The United States has had higher population growth, and in particular, if we look at the working age population, which is defined conventionally as 15 to 64. I would rather it be slightly different years, but good enough. What you see is that there's actually been a small decline in Europe's working age population and a significant, although not very rapid, rise in the United States. And how much of the growth disparity between Europe and the United States is accounted for by demography, by population? The answer is all of it, or actually more than all of it. Europe as a whole has had slightly faster growth in GDP per working age adult than the United States has. Now that's a little bit, that's a mixture. There's a somewhat weak performance in Germany and Germany, France, and Italy. Some considerably stronger performances in some of the Eastern European accession countries, above all this one. So the overall, if you were going to say, well, does France have a bit of a problem? Yes. Does Italy have a bit of a problem? Yes, definitely, although Italy has done surprisingly well these last few years. But overall, the impression that people have of Europe really falling behind economically is mostly wrong. Mostly what's happened is simply that Europe has low fertility rates, and the European Union as a whole has less immigration than the United States, and that is the bulk of the story. Roughly speaking, vast oversimplification, my view is that all wealthy nations are basically the same in terms of technology and productivity. Within the levels of measurement that we can carry out, we basically all have access to the same technologies, and we're all about equally good at using them. And so Europe has more or less matched US performance and the appearance. Europe is a smaller part of the world economy than it was, but that's mostly because of low fertility rates. GDP is not the only thing that matters. In fact, GDP is an intermediate input. GDP matters only insofar as it contributes to people's ability to live good lives. And one of certainly the first thing you have to be able to do to have a good life is to actually not die. And so you would think, so certainly one measure that we should take a look at when comparing performance across countries or groups of countries is how good are we at keeping people alive. And there we go, got it. Kind of shocking, isn't it? Something has gone terribly wrong in my country. And we have some ideas. And the problems that we have, that COVID, we handled COVID very badly. But even before that, there was U.S. life expectancy was below that of Europe, and the gap has been widening. A fair bit of that, we believe, is due to deaths of despair, as Ann Case and Angus Deaton have called them, the problems of people, alcohol, drugs, and suicide, basically, in everywhere, although especially in some of the left behind, abandoned industrial regions of the United States. These problems exist across the advanced world. I sometimes run into people I know Britain best, which is not part of the European Union anymore, but I sometimes run into people from London who say, well, we don't have those problems like you do in the United States. And I say, have you ever been in the north of your own country? The same things happen in all of our Eastern Germany, and Southern Italy, of course. There are places, but the special lethality of social problems which has been such a big issue in the United States, has not been anything comparable in Europe. And I put that down first and foremost to the fact that Europe has created societies that are more equal, more just, stronger social safety net. Just take better care of people. There's only so much you can do, and it's very far from perfect. And inequality is an issue everywhere. Despair is an issue everywhere. But it can be mitigated, and Europe has done pretty well at mitigating that. What about the more sort of macroeconomic short-run things? Europe did have a terrible crisis over in the early 2010s, associated with the euro, the debt crises that many people predicted there were going to be debt crises across the world, and it turns out it was almost exclusively countries that were on the euro. And they were gratuitous for the most part. We can talk about Greece maybe in a class of its own in terms of debt levels. But the other countries that were caught up in this crisis they didn't really deserve to be caught up in it. They were suffering what amounted to something like a bank run. If people refused to roll over debt in Spain or Portugal because of fear of default, because these countries couldn't print money, they could run out of cash, and so you had a risk of a self-fulfilling crisis of confidence that would lead to default. This was an analysis first carried out by Paul Krugman, a Belgian economist, who said these are gratuitous crises, and it's just a liquidity problem. And he was vindicated when Mario Draghi, as the president of the European Central Bank, said 3 words: whatever it takes, which was taken to mean we will supply cash. We will not allow countries to be forced into default for simple lack of cash. And the crisis, aside from Greece, the crisis just evaporated after he said those words. This time around, Europe has had a weaker recovery in GDP from the COVID shock than the United States has had. And I'm a big booster of, I think the US handled that shock very well, and Europe perhaps not as well. But what's not generally acknowledged, I don't think, is just how strong, in fact, the employment recovery, at least, has been in Europe. Europe basically actually confronted with, maybe we should all give ourselves a pat on the back. We were confronted with an extraordinary, unprecedented economic and social crisis, something that forced us to, I like to say, to put our economies into medically induced comas. We had to shut stuff down until we could figure out how to limit the spread of this deadly virus, which was enormously disruptive. Everybody among wealthy nations more or less protected workers from the financial hardship. We did it in different ways. Many countries subsidized firms to keep workers on the payroll even if they couldn't work. The United States provided generous benefits to the unemployed. But we managed to insulate, and we all have managed to bounce back. If you had not known that there was a pandemic, and you looked at employment numbers just about anywhere in the OECD, anywhere among the wealthier nations, you would not know that anything had happened. Look at where they are now. And just a case in point, a simple one. To actually a bit of a contrast. Spain, which was at the heart of the euro crisis, had awesomely high unemployment at the worst of it. That peak up there is just about when Mario Draghi said whatever it takes, and suddenly everything went away. And they did have unemployment numbers have been were funny during the pandemic because some countries kept workers nominally on the job even if they weren't working, and others like the United States had them openly counted as unemployed. But in any case, here we are now, and unemployment by most of Europe actually has lower unemployment, higher employment ratios adjusted for demography than before COVID. So, well done. Successful policies undertaken. Everybody is extremely upset about inflation. We did have a burst of inflation that there were many diagnoses, and in the United States, we had a great deal of criticism of the Biden administration for deficit spending, for continuing deficit spending even after the pandemic was starting to fade away, which was blamed for inflation. But there was always an alternative story, which said that what we're really looking at are the disruptive effects of recovery from a pandemic that dislocated the economy, that greatly reduced the at first led people to stay home and not work and not spend. But then when the economy began to recover, it was different. We didn't buy the same things as we did before. We did less retail shopping in stores and more online. For a little while, people stopped going to the gym and started buying exercise equipment again. Instead, we had a lot of, famously, supply chain problems. Because prices rise much more easily than they fall. That big shift, people simply spending their money on different stuff and the economy not able to quickly adapt, was inflationary. And it turns out, it's pretty clear now, given how quickly inflation has come down, that the problem was, in fact, more temporary dislocations in the aftermath of the pandemic. And one way to see that, which also makes the case, I'd say, both for Europe and for the United States in their response to the crisis, is to compare inflation on the two sides of the Atlantic, which, if there are any economists who are data nerds, you know that this is always a little bit problematic because we don't calculate consumer prices the same way. There are some big differences in measures, but the United States does compute a measure of inflation that more or less matches the harmonized index of consumer prices that's used in the European Union. Here I'm going to show you, this is going to show you cumulative inflation, the cumulative rise in consumer prices since the beginning of the pandemic in the United States and in the Euro area. And this is actually shocking because, within the limits of statistical noise, it's identical. We had what's truly amazing with all of the arguments about policy, all of the differences, all of the ways in which the structures of our economies are different, structures of our labor markets are different. In the end, cumulative European inflation and cumulative US inflation, it's 20 percentage points with only a fraction of a percentage point difference between the two. I view this as a success story because the rates of inflation have come way down. So we had a one-time jump in prices on both sides of the Atlantic, which was arguably the right thing to do to deal with the disruption, and now it's behind us. And I often use this chart to defend US performance, but it also is saying that European performance has been fine as well. So the basic story of European economic performance is that to the extent that there's a longer run problem, it seems to be mostly, it's not really productivity. I think that the technological issues are overstated. It's mostly, if you like, your problem is lack of a sufficient number of Europeans. It's low fertility and low population growth, which does reduce Europe's role in the world and also does store up some problems for the future. Because if you have a generous set of social benefits, first of all, social benefits tend to be more expensive for older people. Obviously, it's true if we're talking about retirement benefits, but it's also true for health care, where young people are very cheap and older people not. And if you have an aging population, this does mean that the fiscal sustainability becomes an issue. And there are going to be a lot of hard choices ahead for European countries and the United States as our societies get older. The US demographic picture is better, but on the other hand, our politics are difficult everywhere, but possibly even worse in my home. So, this is going to be difficult, but I would say that given the experience so far, these are the kinds of problems that you really can resolve. What I'm more uncertain about, and where I think the conflict becomes the disappointment, the extent to which Europe has not lived up to everything we hoped, does involve the ability of Europe to act as a force for good on the world stage. For a long, long time, we basically we lived under the Pax Americana. We basically lived in a situation where the United States set up rules, enforced those rules. Obviously, there was a Cold War, but and things like trade, generally guaranteeing peace, the United States took the lead, and Europe, even amid enormous economic and considerable social success, kind of acted as a free rider on the United States there. The hope always was that Europe would eventually rise to the role of basically co-equal status with the United States in maintaining a decent world order. And at this point, I have to say, the hope is that Europe, to some extent, may need to step up and take the place of the United States as the guarantor of a decent world order, given politics at home. Europe has faced some huge challenges now, and to which it has responded better than people think. So obviously, there's a war going on. For a full-scale, conventional war of aggression, of the kind of thing that we thought was never going to happen again, and which hasn't happened within Europe. It was especially problematic in the first place for Europe because so much of Europe had allowed itself to become dependent for energy on an autocratic, aggressive power. And quick moment, I'm not sure, let me just say, I was in the US government for 1 year in 1982-83. Very junior, sitting behind the table, passing notes up to my principal. But I remember some meetings where the United States was trying to stop Germany from building gas pipelines to Russia. They didn't want Germany to become dependent on Russian gas. And they were right. They didn't manage to stop it, but it was a definite concern. What is interesting is, first of all, how well Europe has coped with the cutoff. There was a lot of doomsaying about what would happen with the war and the cutoff. It was nasty for a little while. This is the price of natural gas in the Netherlands, actually. Suddenly, natural gas is not easily traded on a global scale. It has to be traded, the easiest way to transport is with pipelines, so you need to be in contiguous areas unless you're prepared to make the investment in ships and terminals for liquefied natural gas. And everybody said, oh, it would take years and years for Europe to be able to build enough capacity to turn to alternatives. It took actually just a few months. The terminals were built. There was significant conservation. It's not all perfect, and I understand some people are a little worried that, that we had 2 mild winters. What about the next one? But overall, Europe responded to the economic disruption from the war in Ukraine very well. And what really is not known, at least in the United States, is the extent to which Europe responded to the foreign policy challenge. I am constantly getting on the U.S. front claims that why the United States is aiding Ukraine, why isn't Europe part of this? Why aren't they bearing their share? People haven't looked at all at the facts. Surprise. This is from the Kiel Institute. Actual aid to Ukraine from the United States and from Europe, both European countries and European institutions. And in fact, it's the opposite. Most of the aid to Ukraine is coming from Europe, not from the United States. What is true is that because of years and years of low defense budgets, Europe does not have the armaments capacity. So the United States is still the decisive supplier, though not solely, but the United States is still the decisive supplier of weapons. But in terms of economic aid, Europe has actually risen to the challenge extremely well, has actually done a lot. And may well have to do even more if you know, depending on this election in the United States, but Europe has responded pretty well. What we don't have yet is anything like, this is a reaction to a crisis. What we don't have yet from Europe is anything like the kind of role of guarantor of the world's institutions that the United States has long played. I thought the place where we came closest was trade, where the European Union does negotiate collectively as a unit on world trade. And in fact, for some time now, the world trade system has been kind of a co-monarchy of the United States and the European Union, which worked fairly well, except right now we have this wave of anti-trade sentiment and politics, so I'm not sure how much that matters. The rest of it, well, we need more. And I don't know, you know, obviously there's enormous political discontent, both sides of the Atlantic. Not sure, we may be looking at a lot more problems. But coming back to my early point, there's been doomsaying about Europe and saying Europe just cannot rise to the occasion, Europe cannot maintain its relatively equal, relatively decent societies. And I've been hearing that for, I think the first time people lectured me about the unsustainability of European welfare states and Eurosclerosis would have been in 1979. So people have been doomsaying Europe for 45 years. And I guess I'm optimistic that in the end, Europe will manage to get its act together. No guarantees that any of us will, but if you ask, what do I think about the future of Europe? I'm worried, as one always should be, but I'm actually also more optimistic than you might think. On that note, thank you.